The restaurant was known for its elegance, a place where the city's elite gathered to dine in style. With its dim lighting, soft jazz music, and a menu crafted by one of the most renowned chefs in the region, it was the kind of place where every detail was meticulously attended to. On this particular Saturday, the restaurant was buzzing with even more energy than usual. The private dining room had been booked months in advance for a wedding reception, and the event was set to be a grand affair. The bride and groom were young, attractive, and from well-to-do families. They had spared no expense in making sure their wedding was the talk of the town. The guest list was a who's who of the city's social scene, celebrities, politicians, and business tycoons. The restaurant staff had been briefed for weeks leading up to the event, ensuring that everything would go off without a hitch. This was a night where everything had to be perfect. But behind the scenes, there was tension in the kitchen. The restaurant staff was a mix of seasoned professionals and younger, more inexperienced workers. Among them was Leo, a mute dishwasher who had been with the restaurant for a little over a year. Leo was a mystery to most of the staff. He was quiet, kept to himself, and communicated mostly through nods and hand gestures. His silence made him an easy target for jokes and mockery. Leo had come from a background that no one in the restaurant knew about. He wasn't always a dishwasher. In fact, he had once been a paramedic, saving lives on a daily basis. But after a tragic accident where he was the lone survivor, something in Leo had broken. He lost his voice, not physically, but emotionally. He withdrew from the world, choosing a quiet life of solitude and taking the job as a dishwasher to pay his bills. It was an existence that allowed him to be invisible, to escape the constant reminders of the life he had once lived. The other staff members didn't know any of this. To them, Leo was just the mute dishwasher, a man who worked in the background while they took center stage. Mark, one of the senior waiters, was particularly harsh on Leo. Mark was charismatic and confident, always the life of the party among the staff, but he had a cruel streak. He often imitated Leo's silent gestures, making fun of his inability to speak. Others would join in, laughing at Leo's expense, never once considering the pain their words might cause. That night, the kitchen was a flurry of activity. Orders were coming in non-stop, and the chefs were working at a frantic pace to keep up. The wedding reception was in full swing, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. The bride was glowing, the groom was beaming, and the guests were enjoying the finest food and wine money could buy. But amidst the celebration, the kitchen staff continued their taunting of Leo. As the night wore on, Mark couldn't resist taking things a step further. During a brief lull in the rush of orders, he gathered a few of the wait staff around and began to mock Leo in front of them. "Watch this," Mark said, as he mimicked Leo's silent mannerisms, pretending to wash dishes while making exaggerated, comical faces. The others laughed, egging Mark on. But Leo, as always, kept his head down, focusing on his work. Leo wasn't a confrontational person. He had learned to endure the teasing, retreating into his own thoughts and memories to block out the harsh words. But that night, something inside him began to stir. As he listened to Mark's cruel jokes, flashes of his past life began to surface, images of the accident, the lives he had saved, and the one he couldn't. It was overwhelming, but Leo pushed it all down, burying it beneath the steady rhythm of his work. In the dining room, the atmosphere was lively. The guests were laughing, dancing, and toasting to the happy couple. But as the night progressed, the bride's mother began to feel unwell. She was a woman in her late 50s, elegant and graceful, with a sharp wit that made her a favorite among the guests. At first, she thought it was just the excitement of the evening getting to her, but soon, she realized something was seriously wrong. Her chest tightened, and she began to feel lightheaded. She tried to steady herself, reaching out to her husband for support, but her vision blurred. The guests around her started to notice that something was off. The laughter and music slowly died down as people turned their attention to the bride's mother, who was now visibly struggling to breathe. Panic set in. The bride rushed to her mother's side, her eyes wide with fear, as her father tried to call for help. The staff, unprepared for such an emergency, froze. Mark, who had just been making fun of Leo, suddenly found himself at a loss. He had no idea what to do. The head chef, usually calm and collected, was equally helpless. The room was filled with the sound of anxious murmurs and the bride's frantic cries for someone to do something. In the kitchen, Leo heard the commotion. He recognized the signs of a medical emergency immediately, his instincts from years of working as a paramedic kicking in. Without a second thought, Leo set down the dish he was scrubbing and moved toward the dining room. The other kitchen staff watched him go, confused and uncertain. When Leo entered the dining room, the guests parted for him instinctively. His presence, though silent, was commanding. He knelt beside the bride's mother, quickly assessing her condition. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale, and her pulse weak. Leo knew she was having a severe allergic reaction, one that could be fatal if not treated immediately. Leo pulled out his phone and typed a message, showing it to the bride. "My name is Leo. I used to be a paramedic. She's having a severe allergic reaction. Do you have an epinephrine pen?" The bride, still in shock, nodded and fumbled through her mother's purse until she found the pen. She handed it to Leo, her hands trembling. Leo administered the injection with practiced precision. As the medication began to take effect, the bride's mother's breathing slowly stabilized. The color returned to her face, and the panic in her eyes subsided. The guests, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to murmur in relief. But Leo wasn't finished. He stayed with the bride's mother, monitoring her condition until the paramedics arrived. When they did, they quickly took over, but not before acknowledging Leo with a nod of respect. They could tell he knew what he was doing, a professional, just like them. The bride's mother was taken to the hospital for further observation, but it was clear that Leo had saved her life. The entire restaurant was in awe. The same man they had ignored, mocked, and belittled had stepped up when it mattered most. Mark, still reeling from the shock of the situation, approached Leo later that night as he quietly returned to the kitchen. Mark didn't know how to apologize, how to make up for the months of cruel jokes and hurtful comments. He stammered out a few words of regret, but Leo simply nodded, his face expressionless. There was no need for an apology, Leo had already moved on. He returned to his station and resumed washing dishes, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The atmosphere in the restaurant was different after that night. The staff, who had once seen Leo as an easy target, now viewed him with a deep respect. The jokes stopped, replaced by quiet nods of acknowledgement and the occasional smile. Leo, for his part, remained the same, silent, diligent, and focused on his work. But there was a subtle shift in the way he carried himself, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The bride and her family returned to the restaurant a few weeks later to thank Leo in person. They offered him a generous tip and invited him to dinner, but he declined. Leo wasn't interested in accolades or rewards. He had done what he knew was right, and that was enough for him. As time went on, the story of that night spread throughout the city. People began to talk about the mute dishwasher who had saved a life, about the quiet hero who had stepped out of the shadows when no one else could. The restaurant's reputation grew, not just for its food, but for the character of its staff. And Leo, though still a mystery to most, became something of a legend in his own right. But for Leo, life continued as it always had. He remained in the background, content with his work and his solitude. The memories of his past still haunted him, but they no longer had the power to silence him. In saving the bride's mother, Leo had found a piece of himself that he thought was lost forever. And though he would never speak of it, those who knew the story understood that Leo's actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. The restaurant went back to its usual rhythm, but the staff had changed. They began to see each other differently, realizing that everyone had their own story, their own struggles, and their own hidden strengths. And in the end, it was Leo, the man who had once been invisible, who had taught them the most important lesson of all. Actions, not words, define who we are. And sometimes, the quietest among us have the most to say.